Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of True Crime Storytime. I'm your host, Jada. So, I want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who is joining in on this podcast. I am a huge true crime fan. So, what better way to share my love of true crime than to do this podcast and share that with all of the listeners? So, each episode is going to look at an individual crime. So, today we are going to start off in my home state, my adopted home state of Alabama. And we are going to look into the case of the Citronelle murders. So, on August 20th, 2016, 5 people were brutally murdered while they slept. Joseph Adam Turner, age 26, Shannon Melissa Randall, age 35, Justin Caleb Reed, 23, Chelsea Marie Reed, who was married to Justin and at the time was pregnant, 5 months pregnant with their first child, and Robert Lee Brown, 26. Also in the home was Lynetta Lester, Joseph's sister, and an infant who belonged to Shannon and Joseph. All 5 victims lived in the house together, and Lynetta had come to her brother's house to seek refuge from her abusive ex-boyfriend, Derek Dearman. Around 1 a.m. the morning of the killings, the local sheriff received a call from the residents, and it was reported that Derek was on the property. Officers arrived, they searched, but couldn't seem to locate Derek. There wasn't any evidence that he was there if he had been there. He wasn't there anymore. So, sometime after the sheriff's department left, Derek returned to the property and broke into the home through a sliding glass door. And it was at that point he began to murder each victim with an axe that he had supposedly located in the yard of the home. It was reported one of the victims did attempt to defend himself with a gun, but Derek was able to get that gun and used it to continue his killing spree. Lynetta was woken by the gunshots, and she did attempt to flee with her brother and sister-in-law's baby, but was reportedly stopped by Dearman, who forced her into a vehicle. He then drove with Lynetta and the baby around 30 miles away from Citronelle to his father's home in Leakesville, Mississippi. And it was at this point that he did let Lynetta and the baby go. Lynetta returned to Citronelle and informed the police of the killings, and around 4 p.m. that day, police arrived at the home and did unfortunately find all 5 adult victims. Back in Mississippi, Derek's dad was able to convince him that he did need to turn himself into the police, and it was reported that he was on drugs at the time that the murders were committed, and he says that when he started to sober up, he realized he needed to go to the police and confess to the killings. So Dearman did wind up surrendering himself at the sheriff's office in Greene County, Mississippi. It was later determined that he was actually out on bond at the time of the killings for a burglary charge in Mississippi. And Dearman did have an extensive criminal history ranging from disorderly conduct, telephone harassment, resisting arrest, and a burglary of a dwelling. After the killings, Derek's ex-wife actually did come forward and speak somewhat on their relationship. She told reporters that she had divorced Dearman in 2010 due to his temper. She was quoted saying things like, "He always had a temper, especially when he didn't get his way. I once woke up to him holding a knife to my throat in bed with my baby in the crib. And he made threats the entire time we were together and even after we separated." After Dearman was transported from Mississippi to Mobile, he had been arrested in Mississippi and extradited to Mobile, where the crimes had occurred. He told reporters, don't do drugs. I was on drugs. I'm sorry. I deserve to die. That's all I gotta say. On October 31st, 2016, he was charged with 6 counts of capital murder, one for each victim, and one additional count for the life of the unborn child. And since the fetus was viable, it fell under the Alabama fetal homicide law. He was also charged with 2 counts of abduction, and at the time he pled not guilty to all counts. In September of 2016, so about a month after the crimes, um, roundabout, the house actually burned down in a mysterious fire. The local sheriff's office had received an email tip off that the house would be burned down. Um, I had a hard time finding a lot of information about the fire itself. There were some reports that the sheriff's office was looking into it, but they didn't have a cause. There were a couple reports that said the sheriff said it was not an arson. So as far as I could tell, there was no definitive reason, at least that I could find, that they determined the cause of the fire. But thankfully, at the time of the fire, the police had already finished their investigation and no evidence was actually lost. But unfortunately, the family did lose personal possessions that had belonged to the victims. Over the course of the trial, Dearman was actually appointed 2 defense attorneys, but before all was said and done, he had actually decided to represent himself. One of the attorneys wound up stepping down from the case, and then by the time that the case actually went to trial, he wound up deciding he waived his right to counsel. So he basically went to jury by himself. So in August of 2017, a year after the killings, the judge ordered Dearman to undergo a mental evaluation to determine his competency to stand trial. This was due to the fact that his attorneys at the time claimed he was not in his right mind due to the drugs he was on at the time of the killings. There were 3 specifics that this eval was set to determine: his mental capacity at the time of the crimes, his IQ, and his competency to stand trial. Dearman actually wanted there to be limits on the testing, but the judge denied that motion. After the conclusion of the mental eval test, the judge did determine that he was fit to stand trial, and in 2018, September of 2018, Dearman pled guilty to all charges. The judge accepted his plea, but he was still required to stand trial and be found guilty by a jury according to Alabama law. So by the time that Dearman went to trial, there had been a significant amount of delays. And like I said before, he had actually waived his right to counsel, and so he wound up facing the jury alone. In October of 2018, Derek Dearman was sentenced to death in an Alabama court, and he currently resides in Holman Correctional in Atmore, Alabama. So that is the story of the Citronelle, Alabama murders. I know this particular episode was not that long, but everyone, is going to vary slightly depending on the facts of the case and the information that's out there about it. But the point of this podcast is basically to share my love of true crime with all of you. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope